Henry VIII is often reduced to a caricature larger-than-life monarch, defined by his 6 wives, his break from the Catholic Church, and his infamous temper. But this simplification masks the tragic and horrifying reality of the man who ruled England during one of its most turbulent eras. Henry was not merely a powerful king, he was a deeply broken human being, destroyed by a combination of physical ailments, psychological trauma, and an insatiable lust for control that corrupted every aspect of his reign. His life story reads less like a royal biography and more like a descent into madness and decay, where power was wielded not just to shape a nation, but to mask personal suffering and inflict cruelty on those closest to him. In his youth, Henry was the very image of Renaissance royalty, handsome, athletic, intelligent, and charismatic. He excelled in music, poetry, and sport, especially jousting, and his court was a vibrant center of culture and power. Yet all this changed drastically after a devastating jousting accident in 1536 that left him unconscious for hours and likely caused a severe traumatic brain injury. This event marked a turning point, ushering in years of physical decline and mental instability. Before the injury, Henry was known for his warmth and vigor. Afterward, he became unpredictable, quick to anger, and deeply paranoid, prone to violent mood swings that left those around him walking on eggshells. His mental health unraveled in a time when psychological illness was poorly understood and heavily stigmatized, and this only served to isolate him further, and cruelty. As his mind faltered, his body became a grotesque testament to his suffering. Over the years, Henry gained an extraordinary amount of weight, eventually tipping the scales at nearly 400 pounds, nearly 3 times the average man of the period. His waist grew to a staggering 54 inches, making him larger around than many of his subjects were tall. The king's enormous bulk made even simple movements agonizingly difficult. He could barely walk without assistance, and was often carried from room to room by his attendants, or hoisted into chairs by mechanical contraptions. Yet the most harrowing affliction was the condition of his legs, covered in massive festering ulcers. These wounds wept pus and emitted a stench so overpowering that servants and courtiers alike had to cover their faces with perfumed cloths to approach him. The unbearable smell filled the palace halls and lingered long after Henry had passed by. Servants dreaded caring for the king's wounds so much that they drew lots to determine who would perform this gruesome task, often seeing it as a cruel punishment. The chronic infections and relentless pain must have been unbearable. Yet Henry's public image remained one of imperial authority and unyielding strength. Masking the grotesque reality beneath the king's physical and mental deterioration was mirrored in the tragic fates of his 6 wives, whose lives were marked by manipulation, betrayal, and often brutal ends. The simplistic rhyme about Henry's wives divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, fails to capture the depth of suffering they endured. Anne Boleyn, the queen who captivated Henry's heart and shattered the Catholic Church, was destroyed by his paranoia and cruelty. Her downfall was not a sudden act of justice, but a prolonged campaign of humiliation and terror. Henry forced false confessions from several men, including Anne's own brother, who were tortured and executed to frame her for adultery and treason. In a final act of psychological torment, Anne was forced to watch these executions before she herself was led to the scaffold. Her death was a grim conclusion to a terrifying ordeal, orchestrated by a husband consumed by suspicion and the need to control. Catherine Howard, Henry's 5th wife, suffered a similar fate, but with an added layer of cruelty. Barely a teenager when she married the aging king, Catherine's past relationships were weaponized against her in a legal and political assault that culminated in her execution. Henry went so far as to change the laws of the land to criminalize any future queen who concealed her sexual history, transforming what was once a private matter into a capital offense. This petty vindictiveness revealed the king's profound insecurities and desperate desire to maintain absolute dominance over his wives. Meanwhile, Catherine of Aragon, Henry's 1st wife and once a beloved queen, was cast aside and isolated. For years, forced into effective house arrest, forbidden from seeing her daughter Mary, and subjected to cruel rumors that questioned her sanity. Catherine died broken and alone, her loyal letters to Henry left unanswered. Anne, of Cleves, Henry's fourth wife, escaped execution only by agreeing to a politically motivated annulment and publicly thanking the king for his mercy. An act of survival in a court ruled by fear and ruthlessness. Jane Seymour, the queen, who finally gave Henry his long-desired male heir, died shortly after childbirth. Yet Henry's grief was fleeting. 9 days after her funeral, he was already planning his next marriage, treating his wives as disposable tools in the pursuit of political power and dynastic security. Henry's cruelty extended beyond physical violence or political machinations. His affections were capricious and manipulative, lavishing gifts and warmth one day and then withdrawing all favor, humiliating or threatening his wives the next. This unpredictable emotional landscape kept the queens in a constant state of fear and uncertainty. The psychological games he played were a form of control as lethal as any sword, binding those closest to him in chains of anxiety and despair. His court became a place not only of political intrigue, but of personal torment, where even the king's closest companions were never truly safe from suspicion or violence. The king's final years were a slow march toward death marked by pain, isolation, and decay. His once proud body was ravaged by ulcers, his movements limited to barely more than a crawl. His mind shattered by brain injury, and decades of paranoia turned inward into a vortex of rage and despair. When Henry VIII finally died in 1547, his bloated corpse was so swollen with gases from decomposition that it ruptured inside his coffin, spilling its grotesque contents, a symbolic and horrifying end to a life defined by excess suffering and cruelty, though history has often painted Henry as a legendary and colorful figure. The full truth reveals a far darker portrait, a tragic man consumed by his own physical and psychological torment, whose reign was as much about personal horror as it was about the shaping of a nation. Under King Henry VIII, rebellion wasn't a dramatic last resort, it was a death sentence. Divorce, in most circumstances, was a theological impossibility. Escaping the kingdom meant becoming a fugitive forever, hunted like an animal. Daring to fight back against the crown, that wasn't just personal suicide. It meant that your entire bloodline could be dragged into ruin. This was the unrelenting grip of a monarch who didn't just rule a kingdom, but controlled the very breath of those within it. And while Henry is often remembered for his 6 wives, his break with the Catholic Church, and his thunderous presence in English history, what's often overlooked is the quieter horror, the grotesque excesses, and chilling paranoia that shaped his everyday life. Beneath the gold-trimmed robes and divine proclamations stood a man who was devouring himself from the inside out, not only through tyranny, but through food, delusion, and fear. To understand the full scale of Henry's descent, you need to begin with his table, the royal dining spectacle, that was as horrifying as it was lavish. Forget modern portrayals of feasting kings. Henry VIII's appetite eclipsed anything the medieval world had ever seen. He didn't merely eat, he consumed with a ravenous force that seemed almost otherworldly. He was taking in an estimated 5,000 calories a day, day after day, year after year. For perspective, that's more than twice the amount recommended for an active man today, but Henry was not active. By the end of his life, he could barely walk. His legs were bloated and ulcerated, his frame nearly immobile, and yet his consumption only grew more extravagant. His meals weren't meals, they were declarations of power and appetite staged in public view, as if to say, this is what a god among men deserves. A single meal could include a whole roasted pig, a handful of full chickens, various kinds of fresh water and sea fish, countless loaves of bread, thick pastries, and an ocean of spiced wine. The royal kitchen, which never rested, prepared over 800 unique dishes each day, not for grand banquets or visiting nobility, but for the king and his immediate circle alone. And he didn't just eat what was placed before him. Henry picked and chose like a man drunk on his own importance, sampling dozens of platters, indulging whatever craving surfaced. Keeping up with this gluttony required over 200 full-time kitchen staff working around the clock. The entire operation was like a factory of indulgence, fueled by one man's insatiable appetite. But the excess wasn't just physical, it was philosophical. Henry believed certain foods could transfer mystical qualities into his body. He thought swan meat would give him grace, that deer would make him a more skilled hunter, and that oysters would, quite literally, boost his performance in the bedroom. These weren't idle superstitions. He ate these animals in such grotesque volume that it bordered on obsession. Food wasn't nourishment. It was power, magic, masculinity, even identity, and it had to be protected at all costs. Every bite Henry took was surrounded by elaborate safety rituals. The threat of assassination haunted him to the point of madness, and nowhere was that more visible than in how he handled his meals. Before anything touched his lips, it was tasted by multiple food tasters, servants trained to try the king's meal and wait silently, observing whether they'd collapse from poison. Henry didn't just have them take a bite. He forced them to sit for a full 30 minutes while he watched. Only after this period passed would he allow the food near his mouth. Dining was no longer a pleasure. It was a performance of suspicion. And the audience? Hundreds of courtiers, nobles, and foreign envoys standing silently for hours, watching the bloated, pained king methodically chew his way through mountains of food. For them, it was an exercise in etiquette. For Henry, it was survival. Amidst this paranoia, Henry maintained a strange pride. Certain foods, humble ingredients like barley, turnips, and dried legumes, were banned from his court, not because they were unhealthy, but because he considered them peasant food. To serve such dishes at the royal table was an insult to the crown. Ironically, those very foods might have saved his body from the collapse it was hurtling toward. Instead, he doubled down on meat, sweets, and alcohol, feeding his decay as if royal blood could somehow cancel out the laws of nature. And as his body deteriorated, his mind followed. Henry's paranoia grew into a monster of its own, and soon it stretched far beyond the kitchens. By his final years, his entire court had transformed into a surveillance state. He trusted no one, not wives, not ministers, not even his own children. At night, he slept in a bed surrounded by weapons, loaded crossbows, daggers under the pillow, and guards inside the room, watching him sleep, not at the door. Inside, imagine the terror of needing human witnesses just to rest your eyes. He believed, at any moment, someone might slip into the chamber with poison or a knife. So he remained on edge even in slumber. His world ruled by the ever-present specter of betrayal. The architecture of the royal palaces began to mirror this obsession. Secret corridors snaked behind walls. These weren't romantic or ceremonial. They were constructed for escape in case of an ambush. Henry had peepholes installed so he could observe his courtiers without their knowledge. Crude acoustic devices were embedded in walls so he could eavesdrop on whispered conversations. And then, the most twisted layer, a spy network that didn't just watch over foreign threats, but over his own people. He commissioned spies to report on other spies, informants who didn't know if the person they were working with might be reporting them. No one could speak freely. A single careless phrase, even one uttered in jest, could land someone in the Tower of London. Or worse, before the executioner, the fear spread like a virus. Court life became a psychological nightmare, where allies might be traitors, friends could be informants, and every word had to be weighed with deadly caution. Even the royal kitchens, once a symbol of indulgence, turned into a militarized zone. Meals were prepared in sealed kitchens under the eyes of armed guards. Every ingredient was inspected. Every dish was watched from start to finish. The people who fed him were no longer cooks. They were agents of security. In the end, Henry VIII didn't just rule an empire. He embodied its sickness. A man so obsessed with control that he devoured everything around him, his food, his wives, his courtiers, and eventually himself. He wasn't just a king. He was a symbol of absolute power left unchecked. A man who mistook excess for strength, paranoia for wisdom, and gluttony for godliness. And while his legacy would be written in religious schism and royal lineage, the truth of his reign lived. In the shadows of the banquet hall, the silence of the bedroom guards, and the echoing footsteps of a terrified court. Walking carefully around a king who trusted no one, not even his own reflection, Henry VIII's later years were a haunting descent into a world governed not by reason or mercy, but by a consuming and crippling paranoia that twisted every aspect of his life into something nightmarish. Once a vibrant and imposing figure of royal authority, Henry became obsessed with the belief that everyone around him, from trusted courtiers to his own blood relatives, was plotting his demise. Eating an act so basic and necessary turned into a nerve-wracking ordeal. Every morsel of food, every sprinkle of salt, every drop of water was subjected to rigorous and often redundant testing by a rotating cast of servants assigned solely to protect him from invisible threats. Poison, Henry feared, could lurk in the most mundane things, so even the simplest meal became a calculated and tense operation, where one wrong move might mean sudden death. Yet, it was not just strangers or political adversaries who faced his suspicion. Henry's paranoia ran so deep it poisoned his family life. His own daughters, Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, were not safe from his fears. He suspected them of conspiracy, convinced without any credible evidence that they harbored ambitions to dethrone him. Spies were planted within the palace to watch over them, turning innocent children into objects of surveillance and mistrust. The halls of his home, which once echoed with laughter and royal ceremony, now echoed with whispered reports, shadowy glances, and a suffocating atmosphere of fear. A father's love was twisted into a tyrant's suspicion, and the very people meant to be his closest allies became prisoners in their own home. As Henry's mind unraveled, his paranoia took on deadly consequences. He no longer waited for evidence or truth before passing judgment. Mere suspicion was enough to seal a person's fate. The king ordered executions based on dreams or hearsay, punishing imagined crimes before they could even be committed. The Tower of London overflowed with prisoners whose only offense was proximity to the king during his darker moods. It was an era where loyalty was impossible and survival depended on guessing correctly who the king feared most at any given moment. The paranoia was so contagious it swept through the court like a plague. Nobles spied on one another in desperate attempts to protect their own lives. Servants betrayed masters in hopes of royal favor, and trust evaporated like mist in the cold. Halls of power? Life became a constant, agonizing game of betrayal, where no one was safe and everyone was suspect. Despite the reign of terror he inflicted during his life, death did not release Henry from his torment, it only ushered in a new horror. By the time he was on his deathbed, Henry's body had become grotesquely transformed. His once strong frame was buried beneath layers of fat so immense that he was unable to walk or even stand. Moving him required an elaborate chair with pulleys and wheels designed to carry the bloated monarch from place to place like a royal prisoner. His legs were riddled with festering wounds so infected and putrid that chunks of rotting flesh would fall away with each movement, forcing servants to follow behind, sweeping away the fragments of decay that stained the palace floors. This was a king stripped of dignity, reduced to a source of sickness and revulsion. When Henry finally passed, the scene was more horror than ceremony. His body had swollen beyond all recognition, his skin stretched tight and glossy, while the stench of rot filled the air, so overpowering that even the court physicians, familiar with the brutal realities of medieval illness, were forced to flee. In nausea, few dared to approach, and confirmation of his death was delayed by fear and disgust. In death, Henry was not a revered monarch but a monstrous, decaying presence that terrified all who came near. Efforts to conceal this decay took a macabre turn. His corpse was wrapped in lead sheets and placed in multiple wooden coffins, a desperate attempt to contain the overwhelming stench and the swelling gases building inside his decomposing flesh. But nature's processes could not be stopped. During the funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle, the pressure of gases inside the coffin became too great. With a sickening explosion, the lead casing ruptured, spraying the inside of the hearse with fragments of Henry's decomposed body. This grotesque event halted the royal funeral, forcing servants to scramble with buckets and cloths to clean the shocking mess. It was a spectacle far removed from the pomp and dignity expected of a king's final journey. As the procession continued, the horror extended beyond human witnesses. Dogs were seen licking the remains that had leaked from the coffin onto the road. The mighty king, once hailed as a divine ruler and feared across Europe, had been reduced to carrion. The symbolism was brutal. Henry VIII, the man who had reshaped a nation, had ended as food for scavengers on an English country lane. Even burial proved a struggle against nature's rejection. His coffin was so heavy and oversized that the grave had to be dug wider and deeper than usual, yet the soil repeatedly collapsed beneath the weight. It took multiple attempts to finally enter the king's remains and seal his tomb. The earth itself seemed unwilling to accept the fallen monarch. In the years that followed, strange reports emerged from the site of Henry's tomb. Visitors claimed to hear eerie noises, moaning, tapping, and unexplainable sounds echoing from the sealed chamber. Foul odors sometimes drifted through the chapel, unsettling those nearby. Some whispered that these were the restless echoes of Henry's spirit, unable to find peace after a life marked by fear and cruelty. More likely, historians say, these phenomena were caused by gases escaping from his long-decaying body. But the stories added a haunting layer to the king's already infamous legacy. Perhaps most tragic were the fates of the servants who handled his corpse. Several died shortly after, their bodies succumbing to infections contracted from contact with the decaying remains. The king's death left behind not just a political and religious upheaval, but a deadly physical legacy that claimed innocent lives. This story is a far cry from the romanticized image of Henry VIII taught in schools or portrayed on screen. It reveals a man consumed by paranoia, gluttony, and unchecked power, a king who turned his court into a prison of fear, whose own body betrayed him in the most grotesque and literal way possible. His legacy extends beyond his 6 wives or the founding of the Church of England. It is a chilling reminder of how absolute power can corrupt and destroy not only kingdoms, but the very humanity of those who wield it. If these unsettling truths about Henry VIII have changed your view of history, consider subscribing, because history is filled with dark, forgotten stories like this, and the truth is often stranger and far more disturbing than fiction. You haven't even heard the worst yet.